Thank you all for coming this evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward very much, especially, to your questions afterwards. But I want to start with a question from me to all of you in the audience. It's a simple question. If the answer is yes, please could you put your hand up? And it's simply this: who here has ever had sex with someone without being married to them? Thank you very much. Good. Well, I think that shows two things. First of all, it shows that quite a few people here have, which is a characteristic of our modern Western society. And secondly, it shows that was a slightly uncomfortable question, wasn't it? And that's because we tend to think of sex as something private and of what consenting adults do in their bedrooms as their own business. In fact, sexual freedom and sexual privacy are things that we take for granted nowadays. It's central to our culture in all sorts of ways. Everyone can see that in the modern world, these Western attitudes to sex are distinctive. We think it wrong that in other cultures the discussion of sex is censored, that people suffer for their sexual orientation, that women are treated as second-class citizens, or that adulterers are put to death. But our own society, for most of its history, was like that too. The central theme of my book is that how we think and feel about sex nowadays is the result of a huge revolution that began in the 18th century, the first sexual revolution, as I've called it. So I want to start tonight by taking you back to the pre-modern world, the world before that first sexual revolution. That's a world in which sex was emphatically not private. On the contrary, except within marriage, it was a public crime. And let me give you an example of what that meant in practice. It's an example from exactly 400 years ago, the winter of 1612. A man and a woman are arrested and taken before the magistrates of Westminster, quite close to where we are tonight. Their names are Susan Perry and Robert Watson. And their crime is that they have had sex together without being married. Worse still, they have conceived a child. And for this, they're put on trial before a jury of 12 men and found guilty. The judges order them to be forever expelled from the society in which they live. They are taken straight from the courthouse to the local prison. Then they're stripped naked from the waist upwards and tied to a cart. And then they are whipped through the streets of Westminster until their backs are dripping with blood. They're paraded in public humiliation to the end of Westminster, the edge of the city, and there they are ceremonially, unceremoniously dumped. They are cut off from their friends, their families, their livelihoods. Their sentence is that they may never set foot in their hometown again. Now, this kind of sexual discipline and sexual punishment is a completely ordinary occurrence anywhere in the Western world before the 18th century. Every day, people were arrested, flogged, carted, imprisoned, fined, publicly humiliated. This was the law of the church and of the state, but it was not just imposed from above. It was enforced, it was animated by ordinary people. Because there is no professional police force in pre-modern England. There are no separate watchmen and constables. This is a system of communal self-regulation in which people collectively uphold standards that they believe to be essential. This picture from around 1700 shows the search night, in which the constable and the watchman, who are the men with the staves, have gone down the Strand looking for men and women having sex. And they found a couple and dragged them out into the street. And the caption explains that the couple proclaim that they're actually married. It's fine, they're husband and wife, but clearly they're not. And the watchmen are going to take them before a magistrate to be punished, if indeed they're not married. It seemed obvious to most people in this society that illicit sex had to be repressed, had to be punished, had to be rooted out as much as possible, because it angered God, because it prevented the salvation of those who engaged in it, and because it undermined social order. Now, obviously, plenty of men and women did have sex without being married. After all, thousands of them were prosecuted for it every year, and countless others clearly managed not to get caught. In addition, popular attitudes were also sometimes more tolerant than the official orthodoxy. As the leaders of the Tudor Church complained in 1540, among many, fornication is counted no sin at all, but rather a pastime, a dalliance, and but a touch of youth. It is not rebuked, but winked at, not punished, but laughed at. So sexual discipline was clearly never perfect. It was also clearly biased. On the whole, women were more likely to be punished, wealthy and powerful people much less likely than their inferiors. But the same is true of all crimes in this society, and probably in others too. And the important point is that the general trend over the centuries, from the Anglo-Saxons to the 17th century, was that sexual discipline was getting more intense and more successful. By the 1650s, men and women were being publicly executed for adultery in many Western societies. And this increasing persecution had a very tangible effect on people's behaviour and on their ways of thinking. Most obviously, people had less and less illicit sex in this culture. We can trace a steady decline in the numbers of children born out of wedlock, and equally in the numbers of women who are already pregnant when they get married. The idea that sex outside marriage was wrong and dangerous was clearly being internalized more and more deeply, and punishments were becoming more and more severe. One of the most affecting stories I came across in my research was the story of a woman called Susan Bounty from Bideford in Devon. Susan Bounty may well have been the last person ever to have been executed for adultery in England. When she was convicted in the spring of 1654, she was already pregnant. And so humanely, the judges let her live in prison until she'd given birth. And then they came and they took the child away from her, and they paraded her to the public scaffold and hanged her until she was dead. That is the world we've left behind. It was transformed forever by the first sexual revolution, which began around 1700 and which was one of the foundations of our modern world. I've tried to write a total history of this huge subject, but what I want to do in my talk this evening for you is pick out just some of the themes from that, and I've tried to illustrate them using some pictures from the book.